Stephen Conroy and Michael Kroger. I'll get their tips for tonight later, but let's start with the jobs numbers. Michael Kroger, the Prime Minister really back with a spring in his step today. He looked like he had his mojo back with those jobs numbers after, I think earlier in the week, it's fair to say, with all these scandals and news poll, he was pretty flat. Today, it looked like he had a bit of a spring in his step.
He did, and so did Josh Frydenberg, and quite frankly, irrespective of what side of politics you're on, you've got to say these are fantastic numbers for the country. From 6.4 to 5.8 is a phenomenal result, given what's happened. But, you know, being the Conservative in me, I still want to see what happens after JobKeeper finishes, because I fear that's going to have a significant effect. But it's a phenomenal result, and it's a reflection of everyone's got their own views. I just look at the government having pumped a couple $100 billion into the economy, very low interest rates, and also people not having travelled overseas at all and in a limited way domestically. People have got cash, they're spending it. They're spending a lot on retail, obviously, which is why those stocks have done well. But it's great news for the country, Kieran. It's great news.
It is great news. And Stephen, I guess the government, in a political sense, it's the challenge is to say, look, great news, yes, but it's because of our policies. They've got to try and own it.
Well, that's right. Look, I mean, the numbers, as Michael said, they're unambiguously good numbers for the government. The stimulus package seems to have worked. Michael puts the absolute correct caution on. The pulling JobKeeper out right now, particularly in a whole range of areas, is going to have an impact in the opposite direction. But if I was a Prime Minister, Treasurer today, I'd be pretty happy camper. They should enjoy today's numbers, and they should hope that their poor policy of withdrawing JobKeeper in the way they are right now doesn't reverse this trend.
Yep, and Michael, you know, just that point I was making to Stephen, I guess in my mind I'm thinking, you know, you look at the WA election and voters rewarding the states for great success in the COVID period. The government, the Treasurer, the Prime Minister, their challenge is to say, look, we've also played a part here, and, you know, the jobs numbers are the result of that. But you look at that WA election, what an extraordinary result as we look back at that.
Well, an unbelievable result, and, you know, it is part of the secessionist sort of underbelly that is recurrent through the WA feeling. I mean, you know, I remember being there in the late 1970s as a student politician and meeting the great Prince Leonard of Hutt River, who officially seceded from the Commonwealth. And there has been a great, you know, there is a very strong view. Let's be very frank about this, Kieran and Stephen, in WA, that they carry the nation. And when McGowan said we're closing the borders, people basically intuitively thought that's good, so we don't have to carry these people as much as we had. They're a burden on us, and if we can just look after ourselves, all the better for it. And that's the sentiment McGowan played into it. He played it very politically cleverly, and he got rewarded for it. Yeah. The stronger premiers have looked, the better they're doing on the elections. The federal government's role has been more of an overseer, not closing borders themselves, except the international border. But they weren't whinging and complaining about the other states, and therefore they hadn't had the credit for showing the strength that people like McGowan have showed. And I think that'll wear off. And as we get closer to the election and people start to focus back on what Frydenberg and Scott Morrison have done, the federal government's going to start winning a lot more plaudits.
Stephen Conroy, do you remember an election as one-sided as this in your
I'm still staggered.
History?
I am staggered. I mean, McGowan, in his own seat, I think he got 81% of the primary vote, and his 2PP is 87%. That is unbelievable. It's like, oh my God, I have never seen something that huge for a long, long, long time. So I think it's a credit to McGowan, his strength. He stood up to, you know, the East Coast media. He stood up to the Prime Minister on border closures. He was regularly attacked. But I think the other two factors, which unfortunately you can't ignore, was the exceptionally inept performance of their opposition leader. I mean, yes, he was their third opposition leader. They threw him to the wolves, putting him only 15 weeks or so before the election. But his decision to surrender 2.5 weeks out gave permission to hundreds of thousands of Liberal voters to vote for McGowan. And then he ran on a policy to the left of the Greens, which McGowan was able to say, this bloke isn't a serious alternate premier. And he got smashed in his own seat. I think his swing against him was 23%. So this is a dominating performance by McGowan. Yes, all those Western Australian factors Michael has mentioned. We learned to love our Western Australian brethren and sisters as they keep trying to secede, but this was an extraordinary election.
Michael, I'm always sceptical when there's a comparison or any links made between state and federal. This is such a wipeout, though. Does it have much of a tangible impact in terms of resources and so on for the Libs going into the federal?
It always has a marginal effect because you don't have the officers, staff members, out there employed by the Parliament, but after hours tending to work for the party that employs them. So it does have a marginal effect. It'll have an effect on your fundraising because the Western Australian division will be weakened. But there is a huge difference in Australia between federal and state. I mean, it's not an iron rule by any suggestion, Kieran, but often people will have one colour federally and the other colour in the state. And a majority of those will be not the colour of the federal government. So that's been the history of Australian politics. And in recent decades, the history has been service delivery. You prefer Labor, the electorates have preferred Labor, but the economy, borders, foreign affairs and defence issues, they prefer the Liberal Party. And that's been the rule in Australian politics for 20 or 30 years, and I expect that to follow when we get to the federal election later in the year or next year, whenever it's called.
Michael Kroger, Stephen Conroy, gents. Great to see the footy back, isn't it? It's exciting to see the people
at
the G tonight. Yeah, I think the Richmond Tigers, the red-hot favourites tonight, you would have thought as well. Stephen, Michael, talk to you very soon.